Psychology and health. In this last blog, we're gonna go through different topics on the benefits and risks of ayahuasca, the clinical potentials, psychological tools that can assess the psychological effects of ayahuasca, and lastly, we will speak about the effect of tourism in the medical perspective of ayahuasca. We start with development of wave tests, a psychedelic screen tool by Genís Ona. He's gonna talk about the issues of methodology of psychedelic psychotherapy, and he's gonna propose new strategies and tools to overcome these issues.
Well, hi, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Well, first of all, apologize for my English. I'm not very good at it, but I hope you can understand. Thank you to all the organizers and volunteers of this huge and extraordinary event, of course. Well, as you can see, we'll present you a test, a screening test, to detect subjects at risk to develop severe adverse reactions related to psychedelics, including ayahuasca. I decided to make this tool a couple years ago. Sorry. When some friends, some close friends, developed these severe adverse reactions, and I had been thinking about that, about some possible solution to this situation, because people with psychiatric disorders are easy to detect, great. We have a lot of resources to detect them. But what happens to healthy people, or apparently healthy people, who develop these problems, no? And then I realized that it would be perfect to have a tool, a psychometric tool, that can inform about the risk of developing these disorders even before then they appear. So let's see this idea materialized. A little presentation. My name is Genís. I'm a psychologist from Tarragona. And I'm working in these two institutions, this AYA2016, Psychedelic Medicine Association in Spain, and in this psychedelic research group in the University of Tarragona. I would like to begin by contextualizing a little bit this research. As you know, we find ourselves in a crucial point in time. We are living the psychedelic renaissance. A lot of studies are underway in all over the world, and we can track this renaissance in clinical trials website, for example. Here we have listed the majority of clinical essays in all the world. Not all the clinical essays, but it's an approximation. And we can search them by time periods. So I looked for the studies in which a psychedelic was administered. And I found that between 2000 and 2005, we had 0 studies. Between 2005 and 2010, they have 12 studies. Between 2010 and 2015, we had 62 studies. And taking only the information from 2015 and the first semester of 2016, we had 69 studies. So the tendency is very clear by a glance. And it is also remarkable the support offered by many important institutions, such as Scientific American in several times, or the British Journal of Psychiatry, among others. So with all this in mind, we can see how psychedelic research is expanding and probably will continue to do so in the future. So what happens about adverse reactions? It is necessary to clarify this concept, I think. We can classify these adverse reactions related to psychedelics into different groups. First, we have the bad trip phenomenon, characterized, as you know, by overwhelming anxiety, panic attacks, intense emotion of fear. It's a difficult psychological situation, and all the consumers are susceptible to suffer this reaction because it depends on the context and the emotional state of the consumer and other things. And then we had these several adverse reactions, and here we're talking about psychotic and bipolar breaks in general. And it is assumed that only people with specific psychological vulnerabilities can develop this kind of adverse reactions, not all the consumers. So in this study, we focused in this second group of adverse reactions, which represent the major risk in the psychedelic consumption. Johnson and colleagues wrote this in the famous paper published in 2008. In our research, individuals are excluded who have a current or past history of meeting DSM criteria for schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, or bipolar 1 or 2 disorder, which are the most important conditions to exclude for ensuring safety. And then Rick Dublin, the founder of MAPS, wrote this 15 years ago in the case of MDMA, but we can extrapolate to other substances, I think. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy should initially be explored not in patients whose psychiatric symptoms originated with biological imbalances with possible genetic components, but rather in patients who need some assistance in process difficult emotions that have a deep-seated component of fear and or anxiety. So in the last years, psychedelic researchers are becoming extremely creative to treat with psychedelics conditions not linked with these risks, such as PTSD, terminal illness, anxiety, even nicotine addiction, among others. The most common strategies to discard subjects at risk in the clinical essays are, on the one hand, the application of strict inclusion-exclusion criteria. Here I have some examples of that. In the study of Gasser with LSD, only 12 participants were selected from a sample of 70. And the study of Griffiths with psilocybin, only 18 participants were selected from a sample of 279. On the other hand, the other strategy is to use participants with a long experience with psychedelics in order to be sure about the absence of these psychological vulnerabilities. The example of Carhart-Harris and other British researchers are very clear because in some studies, the lead researchers also participated as participants taking the drug, so it was quite a strange thing. So the proposal exposed here is to adopt a complementary screening strategy, not only to discard people with psychiatric disorders, but also those with a high risk to develop them. This is the key, okay? But the question is how we can do that, how we can know the risk of someone to develop these disorders. And well, with high psychometric risk paradigm, it's the option that I chose. This paradigm, in short, is trying to develop similar tools to detect these high-risk subjects in order to do an early intervention. But the problem with this paradigm, despite we know that it works and the tools are working, the problem is the application of this paradigm, because it is so difficult to screen big groups of population searching these high-risk subjects, taking the risk to include false positives, or treating subjects who will not develop the disorder. But in this case, in combination with psychedelic therapy, it can be extremely useful because we have subjects who will be exposed to a very stressful situation, which is psychedelic consumption, and we need to know their specific and actual risk to develop these disorders. So in combination of psychedelic therapy, this paradigm suddenly makes a lot of sense, in my opinion, and it can be extremely useful, as I said. All the instruments, all the tools made under this paradigm in the past just focused in one disorder, the risk of developing psychotic or bipolar disorder, among others. But in this case, due to our goal, we included both in just one test. So we have these two scales. And well, the graded response model from the item response theory was used, which I think this is the best option. And well, broadly speaking, in the detection of the psychotic risk, we are looking for schizotypal traits in the items of the test, such as magical thinking, paranoid ideation, and among others. Later we will see all the traits included. And in the case of detecting the bipolar risk, we are looking for hypomanic traits. Okay? In both cases, schizotypal and hypomanic are prodromal symptoms of the disorders. The data from the studies of predictive validity is the cornerstone of this paradigm. Longitudinal studies tell us that people with these traits have an increased risk to develop these disorders. So we could consider the schizotypal and hypomanic traits as the behavioral expression of the liability for these disorders. So well, two validation studies were made. First, a pilot study just to see the preliminary factual structure and the selecting of the items. For that, we used a sample of 129 psychology students. And then we did the IRT validation with 510 people, most of them coming also from university, but from 9 different careers. And here we defined the final psychometric properties, and we analyzed other things that IRT allows to do. Here I have some of the methods, just technical things. So let's see the results of the pilot study quickly. From the 99 items of the original bank, we just leveraged 31 of them. We discarded items with loads below 35, and those which were saturating for more than one factor. We wanted a very simple solution. And well, the information about the factorial structure was also positive. The program suggested a structure of 2 distinct factors. So at this information, at this point, the results are very promising. And here you have the results of the IRT validation with the final psychometric properties. And the numbers are awesome, just by a glance. We achieved high values of reliability, 91 and 87 for the factors. The test showed good adjustment, the loadings of all the items were beyond 40, an excellent construct was achieved, and this is a very simple solution. That is what I want. Here you have the function information of the first factor, the psychotic risk. You can see the mirror effect between information function and the error function. When we have small error or less error, we have more reliability. And this is informing about the local measures of precision. That is to say, how precisely items are measuring different levels of the trait. We have the level of the trait in the horizontal line. And here we can see how the most reliable point is located between 1 and 2.5. And this is a quite high level of the trait, of the schizotypal symptoms in this case. And this is perfect because we want to detect people with these levels of the trait. We are not interested in people with low levels or medium levels. We want to detect people with high levels of schizotypal symptoms. So if someone rates high in this test, we could trust the score because we have very small error. And here, well, you have the function information about the second factor, the bipolar risk. And finally, the test have 30 items, 19 for factor 1 and 11 for the second one. Here I have some examples of the items, but I think that I don't have time to read them. So if you want to take a look at the test, I can share it, no problem. This is the structure of the test, wave with 2 factors, and the schizotypal symptoms factor, including these 7 different dimensions of schizotypal symptoms, delusions of reference, magic thinking, and other things. So additional validations are underway. First, I'm recruiting a large sample of psychedelic consumers without any psychological condition or without these severe adverse reactions. With this, we will set the cutoff point more precisely, and the objective is to avoid false positives. And then the test will be administered in a clinical essay in which psychedelic will be given, just to see if the test really works in the real life, and the results are coherent with other standard screening methods. Okay. So this is a specific and reliable tool to detect these several adverse reactions. This represents a fast, easy, and non-invasive screening. It can be used in different contexts easily. And this is the first tool made under this paradigm, combining more than one disorder. Okay. And then we have some limitations that I have to discuss. First, there is this distance between the constructs measured by test and reality, because we have these prodromal symptoms of both disorders that are related to the future emergence of these disorders, these diagnosable disorders. With the test, we detect these prodromal symptoms, some of them, and a risk level is suggested. So in between, there is this distance, and we have to be aware of this because the information obtained through the test is just an approximation. And then this is not exhaustive screening, of course. If someone passed the test, this does not imply that he or she can take any psychedelic without any problems. There's a lot of conditions, also just dissociative disorders or personality disorders that can represent also a contraindication to psychedelics consumption. So we have to be aware. So well, just very quickly, well, the test should be pilot tested by further research. I'm doing it, so, but it seems that for the moment it can be a very useful and reliable tool. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Genís. Next one in this talk is Ayahuasca use across contexts, understanding risk and supporting safe practice. This is presented by Daniel Perkins, and he's going to talk about different ayahuasca rituals between cultures and their implications on their risk potential for health.
Thank you. I just want to start by thanking the organizers. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with so many amazing researchers and practitioners. And I'm not an ayahuasca expert. I've got an honorary position at the University of Melbourne, and also have a position at a government position in Australia, working at the Department of Health and Human Services. When I go back, it'll be in the newly created Office for Medical Cannabis, doing research policy stuff there. But my background is health policy, social policy, and research. So I just want to go through a few things about ayahuasca use across contexts and why it's important to consider. So the questions I'll try and cover are, why should we be looking at context? What are the particular policy challenges with ayahuasca? And what sort of data can help with those challenges, and go through some of the early data from a study that we've started to look at ayahuasca use globally in different contexts. So in terms of why would consider context, like there's this issue about variation in risks and benefits. Traditional indigenous use has had highly structured highly structured settings that are optimally managed to manage set and setting and minimize risk and maximize benefits. The ayahuasca churches similarly have a high degree of process and structure, which also has this effect of minimizing risk and maximizing benefit to a degree, we would assume. Then when we start to go out into the neo-shamanic settings, there's a lot more variation in terms of the structure of the ceremonies, the skill and experience of the leaders, the level of like the dose that they provide, the type of guidance. People have been talking about how it's easy to serve ayahuasca, but then actually knowing what to do when people have a very difficult experience, the level of expertise just might not be there in the same way it is for an indigenous shaman that's been using it for their whole life and has that sort of generational knowledge. And the other issue is that ayahuasca doesn't really fit into the Western evidence-based medical model. It doesn't really fit easily into randomized controlled trials, so the spread of ayahuasca into different contexts is going to be mostly in these sort of neo-shamanic or spiritual settings. The other main area is this political risks and the potential for prohibition and criminalization, which is pretty self-evident, and also a concern that was raised a couple of days ago by one of the indigenous speakers of ayahuasca being used in ways that are dangerous, and that ending up having implications for restrictions of their traditional use. So in terms of risks and benefits, the sort of areas that are important to consider there, situational safety, physical, emotional, energetic, sexual assault's been mentioned a number of times, support with assimilation and integration, psychospiritual distress. That was really interesting seeing that model that Temple of the Way of Light have with that much support. Plant substitutions and additions. So in Australia, for example, there's a lot of acacia that's used instead of chacruna, and it has DMT, but it has a range of other alkaloids with unknown safety profiles. Safety processes in food and drug interactions, how well that's screened in different settings, effects on pre-existing physical and mental health. There's discussion about bipolar and whether that can be, people with bipolar can safely use ayahuasca or not. Understanding processes and respecting traditions. So there was also a couple of days ago one of the indigenous shaman talking about even cooking the ayahuasca needs to be done in this sacred way because that affects the whole energy of the brew, which might not be happening in the neo-shamanic contexts. And then just the cultural container that supports the use of ayahuasca and different religious settings. So in Brazil, for example, 75% of people think say religion is very important to them, where in Australia it's only 21%. So how does that affect the way ayahuasca ceremonies work and all of these things possibly affecting outcomes, which we don't really know about at the moment. Political risks, there's the legal in terms of the INCB has sent mixed messages. They've said, as Ken was talking about the other day, that ayahuasca is not controlled by the international treaties, but they have also said that they advise for governments to control it, and they've talked about risks of abuse and dependence. There's public health concerns. The Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia recently knocked back a request by the UDV to change the scheduling so that ayahuasca could be explicitly used for religious purposes. And their concerns were managing safety and risk, toxicity, which they didn't really have, or they said the only things they came up with there were vomiting and diarrhea, which doesn't seem like a particularly big risk, and interactions with foods and drugs. And to be fair, in a way that data just doesn't exist in Australia, so some of those concerns are justified to some degree. The healing paradigm, that ayahuasca takes people deeply into the things that they need to deal with. So it can lead to a lot of distress, and the Western sort of psychological model is more about making people feel good, about feeling pleasant. So it's a challenge there. There's a political risk aversion. Politicians worried about even single events. If there's one bad event and they legalize the use of ayahuasca, then that's going to be in all the right-wing tabloids in Australia and other countries as well. And then there's organisations like the International Narcotics Control Board, the TGA in Australia, have this vested interest, and there's sort of this disinformation which is being disseminated. So they talk about, this is the INCB, talking about this increased trade, use and abuse of these materials, which this evidence is never referenced. And then this skepticism of the spiritual use of it. So increasing popularity of practices that purportedly have spiritual connotations under the cover of which plant-based psychoactive materials are consumed. And then various health risks. Again, no citations there about what those are. Same in Australia in that TGA decision. Potential for abuse has been reported. Again, no citations. So it's really this sort of ongoing dissemination of information which supports their paradigm. Just on that, it's thinking about the broader costs of illicit drug use. This is from the International Narcotics Control Board. They're areas in which drug use can impact upon society. Health in terms of morbidity and mortality, overdoses, adverse reactions, infectious diseases, public safety, crime, productivity. Across all of these areas, ayahuasca really doesn't have an impact. I mean, people are in ceremonies when they're driving. There could be environmental impacts from the unsustainable harvesting of the plants. No links with crime. The impacts on governance were crime syndicates using corruption to support their dissemination. Again, ayahuasca doesn't really fit into any of these categories. So it really doesn't, in terms of the INCB's own framework, there's not significant effects. So this study that we're looking at is trying to address some of these policy questions. It's aiming to inform drug and health policy, contribute to understanding of the therapeutic potential, and explore this transmission, modification and adoption of traditional practice, and allow this to support safe practice. So there's a number of us from the University of Melbourne, Toffoli from State University of Campinas, and Emerita Opalai as well. So the first thing that we're working on is a global survey of ayahuasca drinking, non-random cross-sectional survey looking at patterns, effects on health and well-being, and risks of harm in a range of contexts. So that's the range of things we're collecting, range of demographic data, ayahuasca use, motivations, history, patterns. So in motivations, we've had about 40 people in the initial testing from around the world. Increased spiritual awareness, insight into yourself and your life, and clarity about your life purpose and direction are the three greatest motivations that people mention. Looking at co-use of other drugs, the characteristics of use, what is happening in those settings. So sort of quite a lot of detail about what was the context of use and what were the attributes of that context. Health conditions and medications. So we're go to the next slide. So we're looking at a range of different health, physical and mental health conditions. And then for each of these, we're asking people to tell us if they'd had those when they were drinking ayahuasca at any point, what the effect on the condition was, what the effect on their ability to, their emotional outlook and ability to cope with having that condition, and then also drug use. So it's sort of interesting that we can get data on conditions that we would usually be excluded from the from pre-post studies. So for example, like the depression, we've had 11 people so far, and we've got a 5-point scale for improvements or deterioration. 5 people were much improved, 4 somewhat improved, 1 about the same, but 1 much worse. Anxiety, 7 people so far, 3 much improved, 1 much worse, if I can read my writing. 2 slightly better, and 1 a bit worse. So there's variation there, and we're not sure exactly why some people are improving and some people aren't, but that's what we're hoping to have more of a picture of as we start to look at all these cofactors and increase the size of the database. we've got a range of things to try and capture life effects, and this sort of draws on research by Rieber and Sanchez and others that suggest that ayahuasca can support emotional regulation, neuroplasticity, improve cognition, and reduce reactivity. So effect on life domains, just to try and quickly go through this. This is a 0 to 10 scale, similar to something that's been used by Roland Griffiths in the psilocybin studies. All of these get between 7.8 and 9.1 so far. Life overall gets the highest response in terms of positive effect, but its life direction and sense of purpose is the, other than the overall, gets the next highest thing. We've got this post-traumatic changes, psychological well-being post-traumatic changes questionnaire, which looks at self-acceptance, autonomy, purpose in life, relationships, sense of mastery and personal growth. The lifestyle, I'll talk about on the next page. Life changes, so these are things like changing relationships, changing career, starting to study, healing rifts, creating new rifts, things that have come out of other mostly qualitative research that we're trying to quantify. And here we've found that starting to study in a new area was the thing that was most common. 85% of people have at least one life change from their ayahuasca. Healing a long-standing rift and changing career were the second two most common. In terms of personal insights, again, we've got a range of things there. That's hard to read, but insight into your personality, a sense of the sacred or higher power, and increased connections with nature are the things that are coming up as the most common. And everyone in the sample so far has reported some sort of insight. And for both of these, we then go on to ask questions about what the effect on people's lives has been, positive, negative, or neutral. Spiritual significance, and this is again using a Roland Griffiths measure, looking at how spiritually significant in your life. So 70% of people say that ayahuasca experiences have been among the top 5 most spiritually significant experiences of their life. So it's a really rich data to be able to use to support the idea that ayahuasca is being used in a spiritual sense, going back to that public health angle. So this is an interesting one. I don't know why the numbers on the axis have come out like that. But this is looking at lifestyle changes, which is, again has been mentioned in a number of qualitative studies. Eating a healthy diet, so that's 70% of people report either eating a healthy diet much more or a bit more. Taking care of their health, about 70%. Dropping down to alcohol, there is 52%, which is reversed. Much less alcohol consumption or a bit less. The 8 is 8% that increased, and the numbers in brackets are numbers that are increased. But what we're seeing is this like really interesting change in health behaviours that's another potential public health benefit that hasn't really been quantified. And from a public health perspective, when you think of the amount of money that gets put into public health campaigns to try and change behaviour, often very unsuccessfully, this could be another really powerful supporting piece for ayahuasca. Other measures, adverse effects. So we look at physical health, mental health. So across those, we've used the PHQ-4, which is a 4-item anxiety depression measure, those first 4 measures that we've slightly modified, and then 4 other items. We've found that in the weeks or months after ayahuasca sessions, between 20 and 37% of people report one of these symptoms. And this is over all of their ayahuasca use, so it might not have been every time, but at some point after the ayahuasca use, 20 to 37% of people have reported those. The highest was feeling disconnected or alone, which was 37, and feeling sad, down, or depressed, which was about 34. Most of those people feel like that was part of a positive process of growth. So there was 26, I think. 16 of them said it was part of a positive process of growth. 7 said somewhat. 1 was unsure, and 2 felt like it wasn't. So interesting, more exploration there to be done to understand when people are having these difficult experiences which they don't feel are actually supporting their health. So then we also look at integration supports, meditation and nature are the things used most commonly. We have a number of mental health measures of current mental health, alcohol and drug use in terms of, as well as current alcohol use, religion and spirituality. We've got a number of measures there. And so these are some of the qualitatives. So we have qualitative questions that follow if people report that they've had effects, which are quite interesting in demonstrating some of this. It became totally apparent to me that my alcohol consumption was causing harm to myself and my family. I've eliminated alcohol from my diet. It has greatly increased my self-confidence. It increased the seriousness with which I conduct my life, examine my values, and choose my actions. My journey showed me spiritual visions. This has added to my sense of who I am. And then also on the integration difficulties, there's interesting comments that we're getting of like, life could not remain the same after opening the world of ayahuasca. Mundane 3D life became despairing and harder to deal with. Many aspects of life had to change and fall away, and this process was painful and mostly unsupported. This caused a lot of heartache. Ayahuasca alone amplified my sexual trauma and freezing for many years. This is now recovering with therapy from a trained curandero and much less regular engagement with the plants. So to summarize, the key areas that we're looking at, and I guess where we feel like this is going to be important, is really starting to explore the difference in outcomes and risks and what are associated with those differences. So is it contexts, medical conditions, culture, the sorts of integration things people use, spiritual practices. As we get more data, we'll be able to look more deeply into that. Really support this idea that ayahuasca is being used as a genuine spiritual religious practice, and people receive benefits that they highly value. And this range of health and well-being effects beyond just mental health and addiction, having some ability to quantify that as well for that, that sort of public health impact. So we have an English version. The Portuguese version is going to be available in November. A Spanish version is also planned, and probably a Czech version of the survey. The next phases would be longitudinal sites, more qualitative data and field work. And there's also this ability to have organizational data, so we can have specific links for organizations so that we can provide them with some feedback on outcomes and adverse effects for people within their lodges or groups. So if you're interested in that, talk to me. That's our website. We'd love you to do the survey, and that's my email address. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Next presentation is Surrendering the Vine of Soul, Ayahuasca Shamanism as Logotherapy. Paula Rayo is presenting, and she's going to talk about her study on the effects of ayahuasca in spiritual needs and existential meaning.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to my presentation. This is my undergraduate thesis project, Surrendering to the Vine of the Soul, Ayahuasca Shamanism as a Logotherapy. First off, I'd like to thank my thesis supervisor, Imants Baruss. He's been an amazing guide. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for him. And also Dr. Ranjit Singh, who funded the project and also is funding this trip for me to present for you today. And also Dr. Ranjit Singh for guiding me towards the neo-shamanic practice of virtual reality. So the issue that I wanted to investigate was the existential vacuum. The existential vacuum is a feeling of meaningless or an inner void. So a typical example would be like you have a well-paying job, you have your family, you have everything you could ever ask for. You have nothing to complain really, but you still feel like there's something missing. So that's the existential vacuum, that's the void. And people are often trying to fill that void with material possessions, and so that kind of creates a bigger void. And so it's a cultural issue because, well, a cultural issue from Western culture. Western culture is very materialistic, and it encourages material possessions as a way to represent personal value. And then it's also very reductionistic because when people try to treat this void with a doctor, doctors don't really know how to deal with this, or psychiatrists. And this is mostly because it's a spiritual distress. So right now in the healthcare system, spirituality is not really looked after. And this spiritual distress could lead to psychological distress, such as depression, anxiety, and suicide ideation. And so I believe in Dennis's talk yesterday, someone asked, why is everybody seeking ayahuasca now? Why now? And I think this is part of the reason, is that most people are yearning for meaning. They're seeking something much greater than just the job, you know, the material possessions. And so actually in my data, I found that people are seeking the ayahuasca experience because they're seeking some sort of meaning, more meaning in their life. So this is an example of what the existential vacuum may feel like. You know, when I go to a big city and it looks so beautiful on the outside, like maybe New York City, Miami, it is very beautiful materially, but when you look within deeper, this is what I see. There's like a hole, there's a void. This is the spiritual state that we're in right now. And I think it's not just individuals, it's societies, entire societies all over the world have this void. So my research question was, can ayahuasca shamanism help individuals overcome the existential vacuum? And my specific hypotheses were, 1, participation in an ayahuasca retreat increases existential meaning. 2, the altered states of consciousness experienced during the ayahuasca ceremonies would be a predictor for increased existential meaning. And 3, people who have a higher tendency to seek existential meaning are more likely to feel enhanced meaning after an ayahuasca ceremony experience compared to people who have a lower tendency to seek meaning. So as for my research methodology, I went to Niue Rao Centro Espiritual in Iquitos, Peru, on December 5th, 2015, until January 2nd, 2016. There were 29 participants, 15 male, 14 female. The age range was 24 to 69 years old. And they were all Caucasian from Western countries such as USA, Canada, UK, Australia. And the way I collected my data was there were 3 sessions. The first session, I gave the participants demographics to collect demographic information, the scales of psychological well-being to create a psychological profile for the sample of my study, and the life attitudes profile to gather a profile for what each participant, their state of meaning in life. And then the interim was 1 day after a ceremony, I gave them an interview, the Phenomenology of Consciousness Inventory Scale, which had various variables of altered states of consciousness to determine what kind of states of consciousness people were going in during the ayahuasca experience. Hood's Mysticism Scale to determine whether the ayahuasca experience was mystical, and the Profundity Scale to determine whether the ayahuasca experience was profound. And then in the last session, the day after their last ayahuasca ceremony, I gave them the life attitudes profile to compare this score with the first life attitudes profile to determine if there was a change in meaning. And so as for my results, my first hypothesis, we found a significant difference between the pre and the post. So those are the group means with a p-value of 0.001. And then when we divided the subscales of the life attitudes profile, we found that life purpose, life control, and future meaning to fulfill were also significant between the pre and the post. And then as for my second hypothesis, which was the altered states of consciousness experienced during the ayahuasca experience would be a predictor for a change in meaning, this wasn't completely supported, but we did find that the alterations experienced in the phenomenology of consciousness inventory was correlated with profundity and mysticism, which means that the altered experience during the ayahuasca ceremony was profound and mystical for most participants. But altered experience alone was not a predictor for change in meaning. There were specific PCI variables, so the phenomenology of consciousness inventory, that predicted for specific life attitudes profile variables. For example, less volitional control predicted more life purpose. So the less participants were trying to control the experience, the more insight they would have into their life purpose. More memory predicted for more future meaning to fulfill. So the more the participants were able to remember their ayahuasca experience, the more they felt a future meaning to fulfill. And less internal dialogue predicted for more death acceptance. So the less mental chatter they had in their heads during the ayahuasca experience, the more accepting they would be of death. And as for my last hypothesis, which was people who were seeking meaning, seeking the ayahuasca experience for meaning were more likely to have a change in meaning. This was not supported, but testing this hypothesis revealed something else, which was that low goal seeking in the pre-measures of the life attitudes profile predicted for change in meaning, and low life control predicted for change in meaning as well. So at first I didn't really understand what was going on, and it didn't really make sense. But then when I looked at the big picture and I saw patterns of the data, I kind of interpreted that it's surrendering. So having this surrendering attitude throughout the ayahuasca experience was the greatest predictor for change in meaning. This is because low volitional control implies stopping resistance. Low internal dialogue implies letting go of thoughts. Low goal seeking implies letting go of goals. Low life control implies giving the control or use of something to someone else. And then this was another interesting result that we found. In the mysticism scale, women were more likely than men to have a mystical experience. And we don't really know why that is, but I kind of created a speculation of why that would be. And so what can these results tell us? I've been thinking about these results for a while, and they weren't very clear-cut at first, but after a lot of contemplation and meditation, I created this diagram. Too bad I don't have a laser, but so here is just like a model of how a battery works. You have two charges. You have your positive and your negative. On your positive side, you have high energy particles that are always trying to get to the negative end because that's where the low energy particles are. And that flow creates the completed circuit, so the light bulb is able to go on. And so during an ayahuasca experience, I think it's very similar to how a battery works. On the positive side, you have your intention, but the only way that you can really receive the blessings and the healing is by surrendering to the experience. And I think that's in everyday life too. Like in relationships, you have to have the positive and the negative. You in a loving relationship, you're giving love, but then you're also receiving love, and that's how the energy flows. And I think that part of the reason why we feel such a lack in meaning is because we're cutting ourselves off from the negative end, which is the yin in the yin yang. So we're not really listening to life. We're not surrendering enough. So I think that we're kind of out of balance, and this is about recovering the wisdom of the feminine, which is a receptive rather than a productive kind of energy. It's the negative side. It's the receiving, listening, being instead of doing, surrendering instead of controlling. And we need the negative side as much as the positive side so that we can have a direct relationship with life. So you can act from what you listen to life instead of acting out of cultural expectations. And so this could maybe explain that gender difference that I found on the mysticism scale. Maybe because women are innately more, they have like this receptive energy that men maybe don't have. There's this openness about women that maybe men don't have. I don't know. And so I think the key is to balance these two energetic forces. And then that way, I think the meaning of life will be revealed to you. And so, to conclude, I just want to use this passage from the Bible because it's kind of cool how we can use scientific data now to interpret sacred texts. So this is from the Bible. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." And this, if anybody wants to read my entire thesis or learn more about how we're using virtual reality for expanding consciousness, you can go to our website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. The next talk is Nurturing the Inner Void. Can Ayahuasca support the recovery from eating disorders? This is going to be presented by Kenneth Tupper, and he's going to talk about their study on the potential benefits of Ayahuasca to treat eating disorders.
Thank you, everybody. First, I want to acknowledge we're on traditional lands of indigenous people of the Amazon who've been the stewards of this medicine or sacrament, however you want to look at it, plant teacher. And also want to thank the organizers of the conference for putting this together. I also want to acknowledge my research team, particularly Adele Lafrance, who is a specialist in eating disorders, who contacted me, I think about a year and a half ago, to inquire about my interest in participating in this study. And then Anja, Anja Loizaga-Velder, another co-investigator who was supposed to present here, but due to health issues wasn't able to make it. And of course to the participants in our study who shared their stories with us. So our research was inspired by the reports, both anecdotal and now increasingly in the scientific evidence, of healing from ayahuasca-assisted treatments for things like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance use disorders. Substance use disorders or addictions have some commonalities with eating disorders in terms of etiology or the causes or origins of the illness, neurobiology, clinical presentation, and treatment approaches. And as mentioned, anecdotal reports from some individuals have suggested that ayahuasca can facilitate recovery from eating disorders. But this is not by no means a straightforward insight, and there's been questions by both psychotherapists and ceremonial leaders about the potential application in this way. So eating disorders are chronic, debilitating, and life-threatening illnesses, including symptoms such as severe food restrictions and purging. There's a role of emotion and its avoidance in the onset and maintenance of eating disorders. Starving numbs, binging soothes, and purging provides relief. Eating disorders are among the most treatment-resistant and the most lethal of all psychiatric illnesses. Sometimes treatment goals focus just on quality of life and palliative care. And for this reason, leaders in the field of diagnosing and treating eating disorders have called for innovative approaches to dealing with them, and we think this might be one of them. So some of the issues about why it might not be a straightforward approach. Preparation for ayahuasca involves often rigorous dieting, and the experience acutely can provoke vomiting. So these, of course, mimic classic symptoms of eating disorders. So there's questions about whether or not this could just perpetuate someone with an eating disorder in sort of the behaviors that that have become pathological for them. Ayahuasca drinking can also have physiological effects that may be compromising for people who are medically at risk. So just a little bit about our methodology. We recruited individuals who had a history of diagnosed eating disorder and had also drank ayahuasca at least once in a traditional ceremonial context, and asked them to engage in an interview with us. We were recruited word of mouth, internet group pages, social media, and targeted listservs. We also had a project website. Participants completed a semi-structured interview relating to their experiences, and we analyzed the data using qualitative methods and used 3 independent raters to enhance reliability, all who worked in the eating disorders field. So the data we're reporting on today included 16 participants, 14 of whom were women, often involving comorbid mental health issues. Mean age was 34 with a range of 21 to 50. Pretty well educated, 14 of which had at least a bachelor's degree. Most had received specific treatment for their eating disorders, often multiple times in various types of settings and with various treatment modalities, including cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, EMDR, and other types. And the number of ayahuasca ceremonies that reported went from 1 to 30. So these are some of the themes that I'm going to run through, and I'm going to read some of the quotes of participants to explore some of these themes. Of course, we have far more rich data that I would love to be able to share with you. We're working on a manuscript right now, so hopefully we'll be able to have that published, and you'll be able to read more. But just in terms of the first theme, perceived effects on eating disorders and non-eating disorder symptoms and processes in terms of psychological and behavioral issues. So in terms of reducing symptoms, one participant said, I did notice a huge change in symptoms. It's just hard to describe, but I felt like I had more distance between my behaviors and, the thought patterns and triggers, and just felt like I didn't need to have those coping skills anymore. It was like my brain was reprogrammed. Also reported reduced anxiety or depression or self-harm and suicidality. So a quote was, a kind of happy after effect is that I'm much more able to live in the moment as opposed to kind of always focusing on the future, like next thing, and just more able to just accept what comes up today. In terms of relational issues, example quote, I definitely have just more compassion for myself, for other people, my relationships with my family. I've really improved. I feel like whatever it has changed me and has allowed me to be more open with them. Forgiveness, that ability to really genuinely connect and to be loving. In terms of spirituality or religiosity, I would say that I didn't really have religion in my life. I put that all on pause in my mind. It just became not really important. I didn't really have I didn't have the desire to really connect with that spirituality. And after, I would say, it changed my desire. It made me feel more hopeful, and it gave me a fresh start, I would say. So another theme was the importance of ceremony and leaders. So in terms of the help that they received from the leaders, one person reported, safety is 100% important, because you cannot resolve trauma if you do not feel safe, because safety is part of the trauma. So really feeling like the people holding space are doing it in a very adept way. yeah, thinking of everything, and I don't need to. I can just relax into that, and I'm safe. So that's key. In terms of the ceremonial setting, specifically things like the songs, the ikaros are wonderful. Yeah, so in terms of pulling me into the body, and the frequency which the songs are played really resonates on so many levels of the body and the mind and the heart that it feels very healing. In terms of acute experiences under the influence of ayahuasca, visions and insights, this one stood out for me when I read this. I saw myself as a rotting, decaying skeleton, and then I saw myself as this beautiful, full-bodied, just beautiful woman with this long hair. And I wanted to be that woman. I wanted to be that full, loving woman that has got so much to offer my family and the world. And then I felt my ribs, and I could feel them. They were just so hollow, and I was like, I can't wait to get back and just start gaining some weight. In terms of purging and how it compares to eating disorders, or bulimia in this case, I didn't purge at all, and I noticed, this may sound crazy, but in the very beginning, I said a prayer to ayahuasca, and I said, I've done enough purging, I've done enough in my life, and I don't want to purge. I don't want to associate purging with, in this case, healing. I really don't. So I never did. In terms of the importance of integration and therapeutic support, the value of space for processing and integrating came up. So talking about individual or group or formal versus informal. So one quote, the psychotherapy follow-up was crucial, and before and after the ceremony, I would say, I don't know if I would ever recommend an ayahuasca ceremony without that therapeutic, the first one at least, without that therapeutic follow-up. Another example, I feel like ayahuasca is an important tool, but should be used as an adjunct with other therapies and support. In terms of comparisons with other types of conventional therapy, or ayahuasca as an intercultural therapy, several quotes here. There's not even a point of comparison with traditional therapy. So there's not even, I cannot compare it. This is much deeper. A human being in psychology, psychotherapy, cannot go so deep, can't. This was really deep repair. It changed my life. It reset my system to zero. Another quote, I feel like traditional therapy methods didn't work very well on me. I don't really remember any sort of milestones that I made in the last 15 years even with an eating disorder. You know, I didn't believe that it was even possible to get over it. I just thought I'd have to suffer with it for the rest of my life. Another, with ayahuasca during ceremony, you can't go anywhere, you can't hide from it. And there's very few things that I know of that could do that for you, where you can't just leave. We explicitly asked if participants identified as drug users from their experiences drinking ayahuasca. So one participant laughed, no, I don't think people can become dependent or addicted to ayahuasca. The addictive substances that we are familiar with here in the West that are designed specifically to allow you to become unconscious, ayahuasca is exactly the opposite. And although you do experience many beautiful things, it's very good at taking you to some of the last places you want to go. Another participant said, I never used substances apart from alcohol before, but there was no point in ayahuasca that was like, yay, this is amazing. It was like being in the depths of therapy for 3 nights straight. There was no way I could see it being used recreationally. So a summary of the impacts, again, a few more quotes. The experience has definitely given me a new lease on life, on my body and life. It's freedom. It was deeply powerful in making deep-rooted changes. I would say that the ayahuasca experience in the ceremonial context has been the most helpful for me in my recovery from an eating disorder. If I'd known that there was a way to make certain symptoms just go away, I would have done it like 20 years ago. So I've reported on obviously most of the positive elements. There are, of course, challenges and risks that were identified. So some of those include lingering pain or darkness or fear from ceremony. A lack of access to comprehensive support for integration. So some people had that available and others didn't, so that it came up as something that they would have desired. Discussing their experiences with other biomedical or psychotherapeutic practitioners, there was often a reluctance to be able to share their experiences with other doctors or nurses or psychiatrists that they worked with. Concern about disapproval by family or friends. In some cases, they shared their experiences with loved ones, but in other cases, not. They were afraid of, again, the sort of perception of being regarded as a drug user. And just general concerns about accessibility, geographic accessibility, in terms of having to come down to South America to have access to the medicine. Economic accessibility, it's very costly, either traveling or even participating in ceremonies in places like North America or Europe. It's often very expensive. And political, the perceived sense that this is an illicit or illegal drug. In terms of specific risks that were identified, whether those are experienced or potential, some of the ones that emerged were eating disorder related physical issues in ceremony, risk in terms of decompensation, the absence of skills for regulation or integration or psychotherapeutic support, legal issues, as I mentioned before, perceived quality of the ayahuasca, potency, composition, adulteration. There was some concern that, and this may be rather than personal experience, but just having sort of reviewed on the internet that there's possible admixtures that can sort of change the quality of the ayahuasca. Concerns about sexual impropriety and questionable shamanic practices. Again, not that we heard these directly, but circulating in the public discourses about ayahuasca online. And concerns about frequency of use or addictions potentials. It was raised, although most discounted those as real serious risks. So in terms of the implications, future research on ayahuasca as an option for healing from eating disorders is warranted, especially for those for whom standard medical treatments have not been effective. Exploring medical determinants for use given the cardiac or blood pressure issues, SSRI use, and in some cases people with eating disorders are prescribed medications that are contraindicated, and clarifying the role of medical management for patients who have higher medical risks. Working to bridge the gap between standard eating disorder trauma treatment and ceremonial ayahuasca drinking. These are, for the most part, two separate worlds, although places like this conference illustrate that there's some points of intersection that are emerging, so more work can be done in that area. And given that ayahuasca is already being used as an informal treatment for eating disorders, support with evaluation of medical risks, preparation, integration, and adjunct psychotherapy seems critical. So I want to thank you all for your attention. We actually have a second arm to this study, which is to interview ceremonial leaders. So we've interviewed participants, people who've drunk ayahuasca coming seeking healing from it. But we're interested also in practitioners, either traditional indigenous style practitioners, mestizo or caboclo, or Brazilian church leaders. So if you know of anybody who pours ayahuasca and might be interested in participating, please get in touch with us. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. So for the last presentation of today, we have Ayahuasca 2.1 transformations that ayahuasca tourism is producing in the traditional medicine system. It's going to be presented by Carlos Suárez, and he's going to talk about the impact of tourism in the ayahuasca culture and medicine.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I've changed the title Ayahuasca 2.1 because it was very bad. And now I have this one, Iquitos, Ayahuasca Tourism and the New Medical System. Before I start, I want to thank the organization for inviting me to talk twice, which is a great opportunity. And I would like to introduce myself a little bit. I am a journalist. I have a master's degree on Amazonian studies, and I live in the city of Leticia in the Colombian Amazon. For the last 10 years, I've been living there. I do independent research of Amazonian cultures, cultural change, and specifically in ayahuasca. I research things like the world of ayahuasca in Iquitos. Iquitos is the capital of the Peruvian Amazonia. It's a city that is not connected to the rest of the country by road. It's got 500,000, yes, inhabitants. Its population is 500,000, and it has become the mecca of ayahuasca shamanism. I have verified the existence of 40 ayahuasca retreat centers specialized in receiving Westerners to provide them treatments with ayahuasca. These camps are located outside the city in a natural environment with accommodations and a maloca. And usually these centers are owned by a gringo, which is the way they call the people that are from other countries. And sometimes they are owned by a gringo and a local shaman. And sometimes they are owned by a local. So there are different ways. Now, I have figures for 10 of those 40 centers. In the last 12 months, they have received 4,000 people who stayed 1 week, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, even longer stays. The average price per day is $140. Maybe you can find places where they can charge you $400. There's places where they can charge $50, $60 per day. As I said, the average stay, if we have an average stay of 10 days on $140 per day, then we can make a figure of $5,600,000. That's only for the people that is going to Iquitos in 10 camps. I'm talking about 10 camps. I'm not talking about the rest of the 30 camps that I know that exist. I don't know how many people is coming there. And I don't know how many people is coming to the rest of the camps that I don't know, and how many people is drinking ayahuasca in the community with shamans, and how many people is drinking ayahuasca in a touristic pack, because sometimes they hire a touristic pack, and one day they go to visit the pink dolphins, and the following day they go and drink ayahuasca, and the following day they do any other activity, whatever they want. So I wanted to show that there is an important business going on there. Now, the question that I want to address in this presentation is that here we are not just talking about shamanism. We are talking about a business. Those foreigners that are going to Iquitos to have these treatments are not only patients, are customers also willing to pay a very important amount of money for the treatments. And the healing centers, whether they want it or not, whether they like it or not, they have to work in a logic and a context of market economy, all right? And in that logic, they also have to adapt to the needs and expectations of their patients' customers. Now, exactly what I want to say here is that in Iquitos now, there is not any single camp that is providing a traditional treatment to the foreigners. When I say this, I'm not saying this in a bad way. I'm not saying that I think this is bad. I'm just saying a reality that I'm going to explain. People have the idea that traditional is good and that new is bad, and the treatments that are offered have to be traditional. Well, it cannot be traditional for all the reasons that I'm going to explain. And as I say, this is not disrespectful at all. I think there are places that are doing a very good job for the foreigners. By the way, what traditional is, we could have a conference of 15 days or 15 years trying to define what that word means. But anyway, I will briefly remark that when I use that word, I am referring to a common body of practices that I found among locals on a local level. In many places in the Ucayali River, the Marañón River, and the Amazonas River. Now, what are the things that have changed? What is this new medical system about? Well, for me, the crucial change in all this is and not just for me. I mean, This is very clear that to Marlene Dobkin de Rios or Stephen Beyer or Luis Eduardo Luna, who worked before me in Iquitos and in all that area, is it absolutely clear that ayahuasca is not the medicine of this medical system. This has to be clear, because I think there is a lot of confusion on this. What do I mean by this? Ayahuasca is the tool of the healer, of the curandero, to connect to the spiritual world, and connect to his allies and receive the chants, the Icaros, and channeling all those energies to heal the people. He also, or she, is going to get the diagnosis of the illness and the plants that have to be administered to that person and the diet that has to follow in order to get well. Okay? Also, another very important component of this system is faith. Plants, chants, but not ayahuasca. Actually, in the past, many groups didn't allow the patients to drink ayahuasca. For example, this is among the Shipibo people that are so popular now in many camps in Iquitos. It was very rare that the patients would drink. So we cannot say that, places that are dedicated to giving ayahuasca to the patients, I don't think that is a tradition. Of course, it's not always like that, you know. But what I want to stress is that now everything revolves upon the drinking of the ayahuasca. I'm not saying that before or in the local contest people wouldn't drink it. Besides the shaman, they would, but it was not the norm. That has to be understood. Ayahuasca is not the core of this medical system. The core of this medical system is God or the spirits or whatever you want to call it. The other one, very important also, and it's the cause of many problems and misunderstanding, is that ayahuasca is considered a visionary remedy. I mean, for many people, what they expect when they go to Iquitos or wherever, they want to see something. They want visions. That's causing a lot of frustrations. For starters, because ayahuasca is not such a visionary remedy. So many people don't have visions. So many people. And myself, for example, I am not a very visionary person. Sometimes I do. But for me, that's not the main point of this. What is for me the main point of this? As for the locals is the purge. The purgative effects of this juice, brew, or whatever. In fact, in the Peruvian Amazon, this is called la purga. It's not called the visionaria, it's called the purga. And there is a reason for that. Is that that's what they use it for. To purge themselves, to clean themselves, to get rid of bad energies, to get rid of filth in the stomach. And very rarely the locals tell you that they are drinking because they want to have visions. I'm not saying that they don't get visions, that they don't like visions. What I'm saying is that it's not the most important thing that they are looking for in it. I'm not saying that having vision is bad, not at all. Don't confuse me. I'm not against the new use of ayahuasca. I'm just, making the difference between one system and the other. This is one I really enjoy. I mean, this system is based upon absolutely incredible struggles, spiritual struggles among the healers. The healers are constantly in war against each other. The most important sickness of this medical system is the daño. The daño is very common and is caused because some sorcerer paid by someone who is envious of the patient has sent a virote, has sent a magical dart that is pierced the body of the patient, and it made him or her get sick. It is a war. And what the healer has to do is taking that virote and sending back to the sorcerer, to the other sorcerer. So this is what is going on here, a tremendous, huge war. You don't want to get into it. And I don't think really the ayahuasca tourist, so-called tourist, is a person I don't really like to use, but maybe we can understand that way. Get in the middle of that. Now, who is the sorcerer? Everyone. Every single healer is a sorcerer in the eyes of the other people. It's very rare that someone would speak about a local would speak of a source of a healer as a great person. You know, they are very controlled socially because they are dangerous. They have this special power. And in a society that is egalitarian, no one can have a special power. If they have a special power, they have to take care that he doesn't abuse of that power. That's the reason they are watched out very carefully. And that takes me to tell you one of the consequences of the misunderstandings, because many times Westerners come to a shaman as if they were saints. Shamans are not saints, not at all. I mean, take care of them, because when you give up yourself to a shaman, you are very vulnerable, and they take advantage of the people. I'm not saying that this is happening all the time. Sometimes it happens, because, oh, you are a saint, you are good, you are pure. Anything you say, yes, I believe it. You need money, okay, because your kids need money. And money, sexual harassment are things that happen. I'm not saying that this is the norm, of course, but you know, it is a consequence of this misunderstanding. In the traditional medical system, as I said before, sickness is the consequence of a social relationship, always. As I said before, the daño is a virote, a magical dart, that is sent by someone who is envious of you. Someone who doesn't like you pays a sorcerer to harm you. Or maybe you are a hunter and you've gone into the forest and you've overhunted something, or you hunted where you didn't have to hunt. That way, the mother of the forest, because you overexploited the resources, gets mad at you and sends you a virote also. So the curandero, the shaman, acts in that social relationship. There is no cure at an individual level. There is a cure at a social level, always. What is the new medical system about? It's about going in. It's about healing in. It's about our problem. It's about our thing. And of course, the key question, the question of commercialization. Well, actually, we have to understand what commerce is, because this system in the past was in some way commercialized, because shamans were specialists and they couldn't take care of hunting, fishing, etc. when they're taking care of a patient. They would receive patients from all the communities, from different communities, and he would have to take care of them, right? So logically, the patients or the family would give them something as a reward, to say so, a payment, which would be food or work or labor or whatever. So that it was in some way commerced, right? But the difference between that commerce and the commerce that we are having here now is that this commerce now is in the context of a market economy. And in that context of market economy, accumulation is procured. I mean, in the other context, accumulation was not able, there was a social control, so nobody could accumulate anything. So if for any case, the shaman would get any money or any tool or whatever that would give him more power, then the rest of the people, if he wouldn't share, the rest of the people would steal. But now we're in a context in which that social control is not possible, because that's against our society, who is the society of accumulation, right? And now the question is that while in the past a shaman or a healer wouldn't get anything of having a patient 1 month or 2 months or 3 months in his house taking care of the patient, now the camps, if they have one person 1 month or 2 months or 3 months, they get a lot of money and a lot of power and accumulation, right? That is not usually shared among the rest of the community because that kind of social control is lost. I'm finishing. I mean, my idea is that you cannot separate a medical system from a social system. It's not possible. And now the kind of treatments that are being offered in Iquitos are treatments in the context of the market economy, right? And the market economy has its own logic of medicine. So there are no traditional treatments, is my opinion, but there are very good jobs being done in Iquitos. And some abuses that I have mentioned, I don't think it's the norm. I want to remark that. But might happen and have to be watched out. Thank you.
Gracias, Carlos. Tenemos algo de tiempo. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Carlos. We have some time for questions now. So, okay.
Yes, my question will be for Genís and possibly Daniel. It would be, where do you draw the boundary between schizophrenic beliefs and healthy schizophrenic behaviour and what would constitute as unhealthy? Because I notice a lot of retreat centres they're trying to prevent people with certain schizophrenic beliefs or schizophrenic behaviour from attending. And obviously people in the academic community, when it comes to risk, they want to limit risk. But then a shamanic culture would possibly choose their healer or choose their shaman based on what the West would define as manic or schizophrenic behaviour. I would wonder what your views would be on that. And another point I'd like to make is you said one thing you were looking for was magical beliefs or odd behaviour. Now, if someone has a mystical experience and comes out of that at the end of an ayahuasca ceremony, would that constitute as schizophrenic thoughts?
Well, first, the application of this test is just focused in psychedelics in general. In each psychedelic, it is necessary to see exactly all the context and all the situations in which the psychedelic is involved. In this case, ayahuasca, it's very complex. But yeah, there's some shamans who treat or who work with schizophrenics. But in this case, we are talking about the risk of developing the schizophrenia or psychotic disorders. So it's quite different. And the second question, what is that?
It was to do with, say...
The magical, yeah, okay.
Yeah, magical beliefs, odd behaviour. Because some people might not, would their belief, when I talk to people here, their belief systems would constitute as magical thinking.
This is because I'm doing the one validation that I said with only psychedelic consumers to set the cutoff more precisely, because actually we don't know if magical thinking in psychedelic consumers may be a little more elevated than general population or these things. So this is, I know this, and I'm working in this validation to solve that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a couple of items that are sort of covering that. One which is hearing or seeing things that other people don't see or hear, which is trying to pick up some sort of possible psychosis. And then one about visual distortions, which is really sort of linked with the hallucinogen perception disorder, persisting perception disorder. And one of the people who answered these actually made a comment in the free text box afterwards that she thought that the question was putting these in a negative light, but it was actually really beneficial. Well, her experience of it was really beneficial, and she thought it was really positive. So I think it's a bit blurry where you draw that line.
My question is for Ken about eating disorders and more generally psychedelics. When you were doing this research, did you come across any previous research that had been done with psychedelics and eating disorders, for example, with Graf's work in the 60s with LSD, or any other anecdotal evidence about the efficacy of psychedelics in general to help with eating disorders?
The short answer is no. I haven't heard, and I'd be curious to know if others out there know of any, because I hadn't come across it in the I'm not a specialist in eating disorders. It's Adele Lafrance who is, and I don't think she had, and certainly I haven't. But as I say, I'm happy to hear if anybody does know of any references that we might include as a citation for previous insights onto this. So as far as we know, it's something new.
I have a question for Carlos and for the panel, and a couple statements. Just want to say something about the ayahuasca tourism, because I'm somebody, I've been, part of it for 6 years, running a center, and I think, when we talk about what's traditional and what's now, what's going on now, it's not traditional, et cetera, it's like, well, we're watching the transformation of a medical tradition, as it's being reintegrated into a global knowledge system, a tradition that's been highly marginalized, as a people, as a culture, et cetera, and now they're getting the opportunity to interact. And then it's the same new transformation. This system is giving the kind of results that we're seeing coming out of Temple of the Way of Light, which were just demonstrated. And so, and then this is all part of this global market economy, medicine. I myself am a doctor, and we provide care for money in the United States. And they did, the Shipibos that I work with, yes, they did receive, something for the work they did. If it's a month diet or 2 month diet or a 1 week diet, they did receive things. And they do acknowledge emotional component of disease beyond just el daño and that stuff. So my question, as someone that works and lives with Shipibos, in a Shipibo-run ayahuasca tourist center that's now being sold completely over to him, is to what degree do you or the panel feel like some of these criticisms of the ayahuasca tourism movement and the participation in Native American shamans entering the global market and learning new things about medicine, that those criticisms are in fact racist, that there's a strong racism underlying this criticism of their participation in the world as members of a 2016 planet Earth? When are they allowed to be, to Ricardo, his children that I work with, they'd like to have a computer one day. Everyone that comes to the center has a computer. How are they going to get a computer, being from one of the most marginalized cultural groups in the country with absolutely no social mobility available to them? So when do they get to participate? And so that's my question to the panel or to you. To what degree do you think it's racist, some of these criticisms that are being made about what's going on with the transformation of traditional medicine?
Do you think that in my presentation there was that?
No, I'm not trying to go after you per se, Carlos,
No, but maybe...
But I like to bring up this point because I go to all the conferences.
I absolutely, well, for me, I think that the only persons in the indigenous people, indigenous community, that have been able to use a local knowledge to get into the global market economy with success are the shamans. That's the only way they have managed, to go and be successful and earn a lot of money. And I really admire them. I went in 2001 for the first time to a Shipibo village. I had an experience with ayahuasca with a young shaman who was at that time thinking of putting up a camp. He was very humble. He didn't have money. And he asked me, as he asked many other people that went to him for help. Now I am the one that is asking help from him, because he has 2 camps, and he's charging all that money that I said, and he is rich. And what I think of him, I admire him. I admire that people because they have shown determination and they have understood where they are getting into. Because if they don't struggle to get to that point, there is no forest anymore. I mean, there is forest, of course. But for so many people, it's so difficult to get, the food as they did get before. So I admire them. I mean, and those who don't admire that, as you say, well, maybe racist.
And I know you're not, Carlos, and Carlos is my friend, and we've been working on this, but I just like to bring that point to
Yeah,
this
it's a very good
discussion.
point.
Because even overgeneralizations about what traditional shamanism is, et cetera, that they only know this, they only believe this, perhaps it's more complex.
I'd just add something to that. I've been thinking about these issues recently and just published a paper in Bia's newest edited book called The Economics, or the title of my paper is The Economics of Ayahuasca. And I think, I don't know if I'd use the word racism, but I think there's more of an indictment against the sort of market logic that's pervasive now throughout the world than to blame individuals who are, taking up the practice of charging money. There's always been a reciprocity understood between somebody providing a healing or a spiritual ceremony and somebody attending. But now the only universal medium of exchange in the modern world is money. And so now I think that it's incumbent upon us to start questioning the foundations of our monetary system and the debt-based nature of it, compound interest-bearing debt, to be more precise, that is the divorce between ecology and economy, and start to look at some of those structural relationships. Those are much bigger questions than just pointing fingers at individuals who are, wanting to feed their families and, have a few basic luxuries that we take for granted.
I simply wanted to remark very clearly that I am not criticizing, or yes, I am analyzing these changes, not criticizing. I can criticize some of the problems, that might outcome of these changes, like the abuse of power, for example. I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying there is no traditional treatments in Iquitos. No way. Impossible. That's what I say. That's what I've tried to show. And I admire, anyway, Joe Tafur was the owner of New World. He did a great job. And I really enjoyed their place. One of the best places I've ever been. Anyway, I wanted to say, Joe, thank you for having me there.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Gino. I'm Peruvian. I would like to make a comment on the coin that you have just described, Carlos. I think that coin has another flip. I really know my people. There's something that we are not taking into account. I think the shamans in Peru, at least in the jungle and in the Andes, are on the way of disappearance. First of all, the word shaman is not used in Peru. It's used now because of custom, but the word shaman comes from the Siberia, and it was Saman from the Tingus tribe. Who was the Saman? And it was in the tribal era. The Saman was the one who knows. Who knows what? What is good for the tribe? When is it going to rain? When is it going to be a good season for hunting? When is a good season for harvest? How to heal a little child, etc. They were supported. It was a table, a four-legged table. A Saman in Asia, Africa, South America, wherever tribal were, had 4 legs. The maestro, the warrior, the seer, and the healer. Those do not exist anymore, or if they do, probably very, very little. A shaman in the seer, in the jungle is called curandero, or palero, or vegetalista. Not shaman. They don't call themselves shamans. Who are the vegetalistas? Vegetal, the one that can handle vegetables, plants. Who were the paleros? Palero means stick or tree, the ones that will handle the trees. So nowadays, the good, a real shaman was called in the Shipibo language the meraya. To become a meraya, you will have to be chosen by the Pachamama, the Mother Earth, and they will go for a 1 year diet since they were 15 years old maybe, 1 year diet. And then that kid was taken under another Mariah, under his wing, and would be lectured. Same happened in the Sierra, in the Andes. There were the Alto Misayos who had the power, they were even more strong than the shamans in the jungle. They had the power over nature, as in the Native Americans, over the rain, over the clouds, etc. No more Alto Misayos in Peru. Pampa Misayos are the other level. They can handle the ceremony, the payment of a Mother Earth. Same as in the jungle. The shamans now, they're no Mariahs. They can handle ceremonies. They can heal maybe. So what you said about these shamans now taking profit of people, I'm not excusing them, but I understand. They come from a very, very poor areas. They see now television, the gringos coming, big cameras, big cars, and they're just humans. They want a little bit more comfort. I don't think that the worst scenario is the sexual harassment. I think that they are more, the worst part of them is the ego. They have personal problems because they are looked down. They are the cholos, the mestizos, and they were always looked down. So when they get power, then they feel bigger, and they feel somebody. I had a tale here. There was a friend of mine who was a mestizo, young, in his probably late 30s. He does ceremonies, more or less 10 years. And he once said, yes, I went to this group, they were foreigners, and how could they imagine that me could do this work? There's a message there, because he was looking at himself down, and he would be surprised that these gringos would really get him to do ceremonies. So again, there's a lot of personal issues in the shamans that to be solved. Of course, there is sexual harassment, maybe a lot. In Cusco, you go to Cusco, which is the mecca of tourism, you will see everywhere outbursts of shaman, ayahuasca ceremony here, ayahuasca ceremony there, and they go for the sexual harassment. But again, who is to blame? There is a fake shaman and there is a participant. The message has always been in this conference: do your work, research. Where is this guy coming from? Who he studied under? How many years? Go for the other participants, ask for information, and then you will be better off. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, but there's no more time for questions. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy. Bye.